Kansas blood and Dred Scott Thud. I am, as
Kansas
always, your
blood
host,
and
Christopher
Dred
Paul
Scott
Dugdale,
Thud.
MED,
I am, as always, your host,
We are at
Christopher Paul
Duncanville High School
Dugdale,
in these United
MED,
States,
MA.
and today is November
We are at
19th,
Duncanville High School in these
2020.
United States, and
And on
today
this
is
date in
November
history in
19th,
1863,
2020.
Lincoln gave
And
the
on this date in
Emancipation
history in
Proclamation, some kind of
1863, Lincoln
fourscore and
gave the
7 years ago our
Emancipation
forefathers brought
Proclamation, some
forth
kind
upon this
of
continent a
fourscore and
new
7 years
nation,
ago our forefathers brought
and
forth
jazz
upon
like
this
that.
continent a new nation.
Everyone, let's celebrate today by
And
not
jazz like that.
enslaving
So,
anybody at all. Okay, so
everyone,
no
let's
enslaving
celebrate
people.
today by not
So I'll
enslaving
see you all on the
anybody
other
at all.
side.
Okay, so no enslaving
Have a
people.
great day.
So I'll see you all on the other side. Have a great day.
Early emancipation in the United States. This is something we probably glossed over that we probably shouldn't have glossed over. As you can see up there, by 1804, all of the states, really north of Maryland, had banned slavery, and New Jersey was the only one of those holdouts. On a really weird note, New Jersey, if you were a free African American, you had the right to vote until about 1804. Whenever they ended slavery in New Jersey, they also, for some reason, closed the voting loophole that allowed African Americans to vote. Now, what you're going to see, there's a lot of clashes between, on the right, a lot of clashes between pro-abolition and anti-abolition groups, and a lot of those are right on the border. John Brown's raid, which we'll talk about after the break, I believe that's one of the first things we talk about. That happens right before the Civil War. We'll talk about Kansas today. So all the stuff you see there for Kansas, we get to talk about today. We've already mentioned William Lloyd Garrison and Uncle Tom's Cabin last time, so hold on. So the election of 1852, you have the Democratic candidate, and this is Franklin Pierce. By the way, I will point out again, if you look at the pictures on the left, all of them have their hands in their shirts, which means that they are former military, and Winfield Scott is extremely former military, as he was still wearing his uniform. And he would be in the military for about another 10 years after this election. So Franklin Pierce, he was known as a fainting general because of a groin condition. He was shot in the groin in, I want to say, the Mexican War. And as a result, whenever he rode a horse, he would pass out and fall off the horse. His life was full of tragedy. His vice president died right before he took office. He actually served all 4 years without a vice president. And on his way to the inauguration, he was in a train with his wife and his son. There was an accident on the train, and a piece of steel swung around and decapitated his son right in front of him and his wife. Neither one of them really recovered, and he was a shell of a person that he was beforehand. I mean, you see something like that, and that would definitely do it to you. And well, anyway, he was a massive alcoholic after that. They called him Handsome Frank, if that makes you feel better, about the whole, son violently died in front of him. Jefferson Davis was his Secretary of War, and that would be the guy who will be in charge of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And his biggest innovation as Secretary of War was, this is shortly after the U.S. acquires the Utah and New Mexico territories, and then there was a big debate on how do you get back and forth, between the, Texas and this territory here, when you're going back and forth to California. And his idea was to buy camels from Saudi Arabia. So he buys about 20 camels. He buys, I think, 15 males and 5 females, and the plan is to use them to cross these American deserts. After about 6 months, they give up and they let all these camels go. And so a really weird note is today in the United States, if you're driving out west, you may see a bunch of feral camels that are just wildly living in those territories, and they're all here because of Jefferson Davis. Winfield Scott ran for the Whigs, and he just assumed that he would win because almost in every election before this, if you were a war hero, and he captured Mexico City. If you were a war hero, then that meant that you would be able to run right into the presidency. Winfield Scott didn't do any campaigning at all, just kind of sat in his house and waited for the election results where he thought he would win overwhelmingly. He also supported the fugitive slave law, which made him very unpopular, particularly in the South. John Hale runs for the Free Soil Party, and again, this is another person who's fighting slavery to help the true victims of slavery, which were the poor white farmers. Okay, the Gadsden Purchase. Now, if you remember the boring story that I told you about how Zebulon Pike, about 50 years earlier, was exploring through Colorado, gets captured by the Spanish, and while he's there, he steals a copy of one of the Spanish maps. Then he takes that map and sells it to someone. Someone takes and makes a copy of that map that he sold, and that was a man by the name of Register, and a man by the name of White stole a copy of that map, and then a man took a copy of that map by the name of Disternell. So a fifth generation really bad map was used to make the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And it was so inaccurate that it forced the United States to once again negotiate with Mexico. They wanted to build a southern transcontinental railroad that went through the United States, but all the mountains and the Grand Canyon made it near impossible to go any other route, so they had to get this land from Mexico. So the U.S. will buy it for $10 million from Mexico, and Mexico agrees because we had just invaded them about 7 years earlier and just kind of run all over them. And I think that was better than, well, it was better than another war where the U.S. might have stolen more Mexico. So anyway, cheers, everyone. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, this is done by Stephen Douglas, and the idea was to split Nebraska in half and help build the transcontinental railroad across the United States. Stephen Douglas had a major reason to want to do this. His family owned a lot of land that this would go through, and it would make them a fortune. Okay? Now, the only problem is you need to get people to move into the Kansas territory to make it a state whenever you built this railroad. So the way that they did that was they decided they were going to open up the Kansas territory to slavery. And if popular sovereignty said that the people of that region wanted slavery, then they could have it. So people flocked into the state of Kansas. They met the population minimum almost overnight. And they decide that they're going to vote on a constitution. So when they're voting on a constitution, a large number of Missourians will sneak into Kansas to make it a slave state. Okay? Now, the truth of the matter is there were only a handful of slaves in the Kansas territory, but there were enough people from Missouri that snuck in to make it overwhelmingly slave. Now, Pierce tries to sign off on this Lecompton Constitution, but it was going to fail. Okay? And by the time it becomes a state in 1860, in 1860, there were only 2 slaves out of the 107,000 people, so did not work as well as they were hoping. And I know what you're thinking. This is horrible. Could anything worse happen in Kansas? No, this is the worst thing that could happen in Kansas. That is, unless you mention what's on this slide right here, and that's Bleeding Kansas. So what happens is there's a pro-slavery mob, and they go and they burn down a newspaper building, the governor's home, and a hotel. Now, these type of things can't go, unnoticed, so that someone has to take a stand here, and that is done by John Brown in what's called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, where he will go to 5 slave owners and free their slaves, and then violently butcher the men that own the homes, in front of their families. And by violently butchering, I mean he cut open their stomachs, pulled out their intestines, then he sliced their throats. So I hope no one's eating spaghetti at this time, because that's probably not a good spaghetti thing. If you're eating menudo, then you know what? You're probably fine anyway, because you're eating menudo. So here, just one moment. So Charles Sumner, he sees what's going on, and he decides he's going to speak out against what's going on out in Kansas, against the violence, against the murders, everything like that. And Preston Brooks is going to walk up to Charles Sumner, bash him in the head with his cane, and beat the crap out of him with his cane. And Preston Brooks is going to resign from Congress following this. Remember, this guy was elected to the Senate, and there were only, around 58 members of the Senate at this point. And one of those 58 members beats the crap out of another one with a cane. He resigns and goes home. They hold a special election, and he is written into all the ballots and is back in Congress within less than 6 months. So, welcome to the world that they lived in at that time. Now, the Republican Party, we've talked about this before. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to destroy the Whig Party. Okay, just even though it's not really it's not a Whig thing. It's actually kind of pushed by a Democrat, but the lack of unity within the party causes things to fall apart. So Abraham Lincoln, who has had nothing to do since he was kicked out of Congress and laughed out of Congress following his comments leading to the Mexican War, had nothing else to do, and so he puts together a group of people, and they decide they're going to create a new political party, which is called the Republican Party. And their main thing is that they're anti-slavery. Now, not everyone in that party was an abolitionist. Okay? Now, for anyone wondering about the origin of the elephant with the Republican Party, it's a very uninteresting story. It's nothing like the Democratic Party, where they call Jackson a jackass, and they go with that. Lincoln used that whenever he ran in 1864, and just used it as a noble creature to support his party. And Thomas Nast, who was a probably one of the best renowned and known political cartoonist of his time, and really of all time, he wrote several satirical political cartoons using the elephant to represent the Republicans, and that just kind of forced it to stick. It's not an interesting story. I don't think it's one that a lot of people would retell, but it is true, which again doesn't make it interesting. The election of 1856. Okay, so in the election of 1856, James Buchanan is attacked because he was unmarried, but the best thing you could say about James Buchanan was he had nothing to do with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the truth is, in today, well, maybe not today, but whenever I was growing up, James Buchanan would never have been elected, because the truth is, James Buchanan was probably the first gay president of the United States. He was never married. His niece fulfilled all the duties of a first lady. She was in charge of all the social parties, and in fact, she was given the title First Lady, so that came to be under his presidency. He lived with Rufus King for 16 years in a one-room, one-bedroom apartment in Washington. And Rufus King, by the way, was the vice president of Franklin Pierce, who had died right before he became president. I know you're thinking that's all circumstantial, and again, I'm not. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. A, these guys are dead, and B, who cares? They didn't marry your sister or anything like that, so it's not a big deal. But they referred to them as a group of Aunt Nancy's, and so there were a lot of rumors going on at the time that they were homosexuals, and so really you have the first gay president in 1856, but it's not, he wasn't out, if that makes any sense. John C. Fremont ran for the Republican Party. The founder of the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, tried to get the nomination as the vice president, and they didn't want any part of him. Then last but not least, you have the American or Know Nothing Party. Millard Fillmore, the very boring 13th president of the United States, decided to dust himself off after really not being known or doing anything for 4 years, and runs for the American or Know Nothing Party to try and get rid of all immigrants and keep them out of any type of important positions, and also attacking Catholics. But Millard Fillmore is the reason that really James Buchanan won the election, because he split the Republican vote. So you might have had John C. Fremont as the president of the United States during the American Revolution, and he was much more of an extreme abolitionist than Lincoln was, where he probably would have freed the slaves much earlier in the war than what had happened. And things might have gone really wrong because of something that's going to happen on 2 slides. I'll try and remember to talk back about that when we get there. But first we have to go and we have to look at the most disappointed man in the United States. And I know what you're thinking. Is it Franklin's mother? Sorry, I'm using Franklin because I don't have a Franklin in my class. Normally, if we're in person, I'll name someone in the room and say, it's their parent, and they're like, there's my child. But, since I'm doing this like this, we're just going to mention Franklin. And not that stupid turtle, like a real Franklin. So it hurts his feelings. So, this is Dred Scott versus Sanford. So Dred Scott was a slave, and his owner moved to a free territory and then went back to Missouri. Okay? And then the debate you have the major debate of what happens if you're a slave and you go to a free state. Are you still a slave once you go into free territory, or what exactly happens? Okay? I mean, you could still make the debate today. What happens if a Libyan prince comes to the United States today with his slaves in tow? Do they have freedom or do they not? And the truth is that as long as they are in the Libyan embassy, they have the same rights and freedoms as if they were in Libya. So, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're freed. Okay? So the Supreme Court has a choice. Is he free or is he a slave? And so the Supreme Court rules that African Americans were not citizens and couldn't sue. So nothing to do with what they were talking about right there. Okay? And the Fifth Amendment furthermore said that property could not be taken away without just compensation. And the Missouri Compromise ban on slavery was unconstitutional. Okay? So when they're trying to decide the issue of whether or not he's free or not, instead they say that African Americans aren't citizens, that you can't take away someone's property without paying for it, and that the Missouri Compromise ban on slavery was unconstitutional. And this is one of the most derisive things really ever done by the Supreme Court, and is one of the main things that really leads to the Civil War. The Panic of 1857. Now, with the massive gold rush coming from California that also will dip into Nevada and California, where you'll have gold and silver rushes, the U.S. dollar really loses a lot of its value. There's an explosion of grain that comes out where there's so much grain on the market it kills the price for northern farmers. And a lot of northern farmers planted a lot of grain because Europe was buying as much as they could during the Crimean War. It was a short war, but it got a lot of farmers planting, and then by the time the war was over, no one would buy all this crop, and there was just way too much grain on the market. Tariffs ended up going up thousands of businesses fail, and there's massive unemployment. However, Southern cotton farmers didn't have any type of financial problems because, people still needed cotton at this time. And so they figured out that they were recession proof and that, they didn't have to worry, they could support themselves. So, had this happened during the Civil War, this could have caused the North to lose, so it's kind of lucky that the war started whenever it did, whenever the North had a chance to recover. This would be probably the last time that the economy in the South was extremely strong, and it was for a very short period of time. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, these are all pretty famous. This is a series of debates that went through 7 major cities in Illinois, and it's for the position of the Senator of Illinois. And you have Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas, who had run for president earlier, or who had helped establish the Freeport Doctrine and popular sovereignty, for Kansas. Not only were they debate opponents, they will later run against each other for president. And earlier they were battling over the same woman, Mary Todd Lincoln, who is very overrated and bipolar and a little bit crazy. Both Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas wanted her. And Lincoln won, I guess, and married her? Question mark? I mean, he did marry her, but, she was a little bit batty. So, anyway. So, Lincoln was against slavery spreading to Western territories. Douglas wanted the decision over slavery to be based on popular sovereignty and let people vote on it. So, Douglas won the Senate seat, but Lincoln clarifies the principles of the Republican Party. Lincoln also was a big fan of the American Colonization Society, to where you would take former slaves and relocate them to Africa. So these all might be things that seem out of character for him, but they are very much in character. So we reach the end of yet another day. This will be the last thing we have going into Thanksgiving week, so everyone stays safe. No cocaine, no AIDS. Don't punch any babies while they're sleeping. Let's all try and be great. So I'll see everyone on the other side. Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA, signing out.